some Australian towns didn't get left behind accidentally. They got left behind on purpose because the people living there looked at modern Australia and said, no thanks. We're talking 10 places where the cost of living is so low it feels illegal, where the 1960s rules of mind, your own business, still actually apply, and where the trade-offs are so bizarre you won't believe people signed up for them. One town has no above-ground homes. Another one has a population shrinking so fast it might not exist in 20 years. You're not ready for what some of these places ask of you. Before we continue, hit subscribe so you never miss the latest updates. Number 1, Coober Pedy. Picture a real estate listing that says dugout, 2 bedrooms, no windows, and that's not a warning, that's the whole pitch. Welcome to Coober Pedy, 850 kilometers north of Adelaide, sitting in the middle of South Australia's outback and producing around 70% of the world's opal supply. Sounds glamorous, right? It's not. The people pulling those opals out of the ground are living in holes to survive summers that regularly hit 50 degrees. The underground homes, called dugouts, started in the 1910s and 1920s because miners couldn't afford to build above ground, and the heat was genuinely killing people, so they dug in, and then the town just never really updated. The above ground buildings look like someone dropped them there in 1968, and nobody touched them since. With servo stations running hand-painted signs, a pub that's looked exactly the same since the 1970s, and a golf course where the greens are jet black because there's no grass, just oil-soaked dirt, and people tee off at night using glow-in-the-dark balls because playing in daylight is not something your body survives easily. But nobody who's been here for 30 years is here because they got stuck. They're here because leaving means going back to body corporates, strata fees, and paying $700 a week to rent a box in Brisbane. A 1-bedroom dugout in Coober Pedy costs less than what a Sydney renter drops in a year on a place they'll never own. Let that sink in. The trade-offs are not small though. Your Wi-Fi runs like it's 2003. The nearest proper hospital sits hours away, and if your car dies on the Stewart Highway, you're not calling a tow truck. You're waiting for whoever eventually drives past to take pity on you. And that's actually the point. The people who chose Coober Pedy wanted a life where the government mostly leaves you alone. Your neighbours are far enough away that their drama stays their drama. And the cost of entry is so low, it almost feels like cheating. Some residents have worked the same mining claim for 3 decades. They're not rich. They're not famous. They own their hole in the ground outright, and nobody can ever raise their rent. Number 2, Lightning Ridge. Lightning Ridge has a reputation in outback New South Wales as the kind of place where people show up with a new name and nobody asks questions. And that's not gossip. That's literally the town's unofficial tourism pitch. It sits about 770 kilometers from Sydney in far northwest New South Wales, right on top of one of the world's only deposits of black opal, which is the rarest and most expensive type of opal on the planet. People have been digging here since the early 1900s, and the town never really modernized because the people who come here actively don't want it to. The economy runs on cash in a way that would genuinely confuse your accountant. Miners work their own claims, sell their own stones directly, and operate by a code that's basically 1960s frontier logic. You don't touch another person's claim, you don't ask where they came from, and you sort your own problems out without calling anyone official about it. There are artesian hot springs where locals soak in 40-degree mineral water for free, a pub that's anchored the social scene since the 1960s, and a population that swings wildly from year to year because people follow the opals, and some years the opals just aren't there. And the property prices. You can buy a house in Lightning Ridge for under $100,000, sometimes well under, and that is not a typo. The main street looks like a 1970s Western film set that ran out of budget halfway through construction. Services are thin, and the population has been sliding for years. But the people who stay aren't stuck. They're doing math that most people refuse to do. A retired miner who owns his home outright and his claim outright carries zero mortgage, zero rent, and a hobby that occasionally produces a single stone worth more than your car. You won't find reliable mobile coverage. You won't find a coffee shop worth visiting visiting. What you will find is people who've been living basically rent-free for 20 years, while Sydney renters hand over $600 a week for the privilege of a 2-hour commute each way, every single day, into a city that will never let them own anything. Number 3, Broken Hill. Broken Hill is the only city in New South Wales that runs on South Australian time. And it didn't do that by accident. It did it because Broken Hill has always operated on its own terms and genuinely does not care what the rest of the country thinks about that. With about 17,000 people, it's technically a city, and it looks like one too, with a proper main street, heritage pubs, an art scene that actual critics respect, and architecture from the silver mining boom of the 1880s that's barely changed since. The whole city sits under heritage protection, which means you can't knock much down, even if you wanted to. So what you're walking through is basically a living museum that people actually live in. The silver mine that built Broken Hill is mostly done. Young people have been leaving for the coast for decades, and the population keeps dropping. But the city keeps going, partly from tourism, partly because Sidney Nolan started painting the outback here in the 1940s and 1950s, and artists never really stopped coming, and partly because the people who stayed genuinely chose a slower, cheaper life over whatever the cities were selling. A 3-bedroom house in Broken Hill runs under $200,000. Let that sink in. That's less than the stamp duty you'd pay on a median-priced Sydney home, not the house. The tax on buying the house. The streets carry names like argent, oxide, and chloride because they got named after minerals. And the front bars in the old pubs still look exactly the way front bars looked in 1972, right down to the carpet. Mad Max 2 filmed nearby. Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, rolled through here. Filmmakers keep coming back because the light and the rawness of the place aren't something you can fake on a set. The people who chose to stay aren't people who couldn't get out. They're artists, retirees, remote workers who ran the numbers and decided that a paid-off house in Broken Hill plus a decent internet connection beats renting forever in a city that'll never let you own anything. The trade-offs are real. Medical specialists are scarce. The heat is no joke. And the nearest major city sits 5 hours away on a road that doesn't get more interesting the longer you drive it. Number 4, Queenstown. Queenstown has a mountain with no trees on it, and the locals want to keep it that way. A century of copper smelting cooked every living thing off that rock and left it streaked in orange, red and purple. And when environmental groups show up with revegetation plans, the town pushes back hard because those alien-looking hills are the only thing that makes Queenstown look like nowhere else on Earth. The Mount Lyell copper mine started in the 1880s and ran for over a century, and the town that grew around it built grand hotels, a railway, and a population that peaked around 5,000 people. Then the mine slowed and people left, and Queenstown contracted down to about 2,000 residents, sitting in a valley surrounded by those stripped Technicolor hills. Walk down the main street, and a lot of the buildings from the early 1900s are still standing, many of them empty, which gives the whole place this slightly eerie quality, like everyone just ducked out for lunch and forgot to come back. But the people who stayed are intensely attached to Queenstown in a way that's hard to explain until you understand the price of entry. Property here is some of the cheapest in Tasmania, which is already cheaper than anywhere on the mainland. And we're talking houses under $150,000, sometimes way under, in a state where Hobart and Launceston prices have been climbing hard for the last decade. You could buy a house in Queenstown for less than what some people spend on a car they're still paying off. The culture that stayed is old school working class, mining town to its core. People fix their own cars, they know their neighbours, and they treat newcomers with a wariness that takes real time to get through. It's not unfriendly exactly, it's just that this community has been through enough together that they don't need to perform warmth for strangers. And don't even get me started on the weather. 3 hours from Hobart on roads that wind through the mountains, sitting on Tasmania's west coast where the weather comes straight off the Southern Ocean and does whatever it wants. Queenstown gets some of the wildest, wettest conditions in the country. You're not moving there for the lifestyle brochure version of Tasmania. Number 5, Winton. Winton, Queensland is the kind of town where the biggest news story of the week might genuinely be about a dinosaur, and not in a metaphorical way, because they keep pulling actual bones out of the ground around here. The Australian Age of Dinosaurs Research Centre sits just outside town and draws visitors from all over the world, which is a wild thing to say about a place 1,400 kilometres northwest of Brisbane, with about 900 people and a main street that looks like it was last touched up in the early 1970s. And that's the other thing Winton is famous for. Banjo Paterson wrote Waltzing Matilda here in 1895, so the town is sitting on two completely unrelated claims to fame: dinosaur bones and Australia's most recognisable folk song. And somehow, neither one feels like enough to stop the population from slowly shrinking year after year. The pub has been the pub since forever. The servo is the servo. First-time visitors sometimes describe the place as genuinely disorienting, like time is running at a slightly different speed. And honestly, that tracks, because Winton hasn't really needed to update anything since the people who stayed decided they liked it exactly as it is. Summer temperatures hit 45 degrees regularly, and fuel costs a lot because you're a very long way from anywhere that produces it cheaply. So the cost of living isn't uniformly low the way coastal people imagine. Housing is cheap, yes, but you're paying for isolation in other ways, and those costs are physical, not just financial. But Winton has figured something out that most towns this size haven't. You can monetize your weirdness without killing what makes you weird. The Dinosaur Centre brings in real tourism dollars. The Waltzing Matilda Centre pulls heritage visitors. The Outback Film Festival runs every year and draws a crowd that would genuinely surprise you if you only knew Winton from a map. The social rules here are simple and non-negotiable. You wave at every car on the highway because you might need that person in 2 hours when your tyre blows out 80 kilometres from anywhere. You know everyone at the pub by name. You don't lock your car because the question of where it's going to go doesn't really have an answer. Number 6, Cook. Cook, South Australia, has a hospital, a school, a golf course, a swimming pool, and an outdoor cinema. About 4 people live there, and every single one of those facilities sits completely empty. The town got built in the early 1900s to service the Trans-Australian Railway, the line that crosses the Nullarbor Plain, and at its peak, it had nearly 300 residents. All railway workers and their families living in a fully government-supplied town in the middle of one of the most remote stretches of land on Earth. The government built them houses, schools, a pool, the whole deal. Because if you want people to live 800 kilometres from the nearest town of any size, you have to give them a reason to stay. Then the railway got automated in the 1990s and the workers left. The government didn't demolish anything. They just locked it up, walked away, and left behind streets of empty houses, a hospital with equipment still inside, and public buildings that look like everyone stepped out on a Tuesday and forgot to come back. Some of the buildings are still furnished. The street signs are still up. The swimming pool is still there, just bone dry, sitting in the heat with nobody to fill it. The train still stops at Cook twice a week for about an hour each time, and passengers can walk through what is essentially a perfectly preserved 1970s government town, frozen at the exact moment the government stopped caring about it. No mobile coverage, flat, featureless Nullarbor in every direction, extreme heat, and people who've done this trip describe walking through Cook in a way that sounds almost reverent because there genuinely is nothing else like it anywhere in Australia. The people who lived there, who raised kids there and built a real community, didn't get a vote when the economics changed. The railway got automated and the town stopped being a living place within just a few years, not slowly, overnight. Cook is what the 1960s and 1970s actually looked like when they were real. Sealed in the desert because there was no reason to update anything and nobody left to do it anyway. The train passengers get 1 hour to walk through it twice a week, and then the doors close and Cook goes back to silence. Number 7, Silverton. 50 permanent residents, and at least 3 of them are probably in the pub right now. That pub, by the way, has appeared in more films than most working Australian actors, which is either funny or deeply impressive, depending on how you look at it. Silverton sits about 25 kilometres from Broken Hill in outback New South Wales, and it peaked in the 1880s as a silver mining hub with thousands of people living and working there. When the ore ran out, people drifted to Broken Hill, and Silverton got left with its old stone buildings, red dirt streets, a few camels wandering around, and a landscape so naturally cinematic that filmmakers have been driving out here for decades. Mad Max 2 filmed here. Razorback filmed here. Mission Impossible 2 used the surrounding area. A town like Alice pulled from the landscape. The pub has photos on the wall from every production that's rolled through, and there are a lot of photos. But the people who actually live in Silverton aren't extras or caretakers or people waiting for the next film crew to show up. Artists moved out here in the 1970s and 1980s and never left because the light does something specific at certain times of day that painters talk about like it's a controlled substance. People drove through on a weekend trip, bought a house for $40,000 and just stayed. The community is small enough that everyone knows your name, your car, and what your dog is called. And that's not a charm and exaggeration. That's just what happens when 50 people share a postcode. The rules are simple. Sort your own problems, don't bother people, show up at the pub, and don't ask too many questions about why someone decided that living 25 kilometers from the nearest supermarket was a perfectly rational choice. Property prices in Silverton are almost absurdly low because there's zero competition for the houses. Nobody's building apartments next door. Nobody's going to buy your street out from under you and put in a development. You own your place, it stays yours, and your Friday night social life costs whatever the pub charges for a beer. What Silverton accidentally figured out is that being genuinely, completely left behind can become an identity strong enough to keep a community alive indefinitely. Number 8, Wilcannia. Wilcannia doesn't fit the romantic outback story. And that's exactly why it's on this list. It sits on the Darling River in far west New South Wales, about 200 kilometers east of Broken Hill. And in the late 1800s, people called it the Queen City of the West because it actually was one. Paddle steamers ran up and down the river. The wool trade pumped money through it. Grand sandstone buildings went up along the main street, and some of them are still standing today, mostly empty, slowly coming apart in the heat. The population now sits around 600 people, and roughly 70% of them are Aboriginal, making Wilcannia one of the most indigenous towns in New South Wales. Unemployment runs severe. Social problems run serious. The town has been the subject of government reports, media coverage, and official inquiries for decades. And the coverage almost never describes it as anything other than a place in crisis, because that's what it is. The 1960s aesthetic here isn't a lifestyle choice. It's what happens when investment dries up and the buildings from the 1890s are still the buildings from today because nobody had the money or the reason to replace them. The heritage and the poverty sit right next to each other on the same street, and that combination is genuinely uncomfortable to look at straight. And the river, the whole reason Wilcannia exists at all, is in serious trouble. Water management disputes upstream have left the Darling low and degraded for years, and that hits the community directly in ways that go way beyond aesthetics. Every other town on this list involves people who picked their situation, at least partly. They ran the numbers, loaded up the ute, and drove out into the outback with their eyes open. Wilcannia is what happens when a community doesn't get that choice, when the economy moves on and the people left behind don't have the resources or the political weight to force anyone to pay attention. The old courthouse is still there. The port infrastructure is still there. The streetscapes could absolutely pull heritage tourists if the context were different, but the context isn't different, and no amount of careful framing changes what's actually happening in that town. Number 9, Andamuka. Andamuka is 600 kilometers north of Adelaide, has no sealed roads inside the town, and when the government offered to fix that, the residents voted no. Not because they couldn't afford it, because they didn't want the traffic that paved roads would bring. Let that sink in. It's an opal mining town in South Australia, smaller and rougher than Coober Pedy, which sits about 100 kilometers away and practically looks like a metropolis by comparison. Around 300 people live there permanently, and the ground around the town is covered in mullock heaps, which are the dirt piles from old mine shafts, stretching in every direction until the whole place looks like someone tried to recreate the surface of the moon in the South Australian outback and nailed it. The town has been pushing back against outside interference since settlers first arrived in the 1930s. Developers float ideas, the community gets skeptical. The government proposes improvements, residents push back. The people who chose Andamuka structured it that way deliberately because the whole point of being there is that nobody tells you what to do with your land. The housing situation is genuinely wild. A lot of residents live in dugouts, but Andamuka's dugouts make Coober Pedys look polished because these ones were built by the miners themselves over decades, and some of them are basically just holes cut into a hillside with a door bolted on the front and a generator humming out the back. You can lease a mining claim there for almost nothing. And some people have been working the same patch of dirt for 30 years, living on whatever the opals produce and spending almost nothing because there's almost nothing to spend money on. The financial system barely touches Andamuka. It runs on cash and barter and the understanding that you look after yourself and your neighbors in that order because nobody else is coming. No hospital. The nearest proper medical facility is a long drive away on unsealed roads that turn impassable after heavy rain. The heat is brutal. The town is shrinking as older miners age out and fewer younger people decide this life sounds appealing. But the people who are there chose it with full information, and what they got in return is no rent, no mortgage, no landlord, and nobody anywhere near them with a development application. Number 10. Murray. Murray is where the bitumen stops and the outback starts making its own rules. And the 100 or so people who live there are the last humans you'll see for a very long time in either direction. That's not a figure of speech. Drive out of Marie on the Birdsville track and you've got 520 kilometers of unsealed road before you hit another town. And the Udnadata track going the other way isn't much friendlier. Neither road is sealed. Both will absolutely destroy your car if you treat them casually. Mari sits about 700 kilometers north of Adelaide at the junction of those two tracks, and it used to anchor the old Garn Railway route running from Adelaide up to Alice Springs. When that line got relocated in the 1980s, the railway took Marie's main reason for existing with it. The population dropped, the town contracted, and what's left now is a pub, a general store, a caravan park, and a small community doing something the modern world genuinely can't automate, being the last humans before the track swallows you. The pub is doing more work than any pub should have to. It's the social centre, the information point, and the unofficial emergency coordination system all at once, because the publican tracks which vehicles headed out when they left and when they're supposed to be back, not as a formal system, just as how things work when the stakes of getting it wrong are that high. Property is cheap, noise is non-existent, and nobody's competing for anything. Fuel and food cost more because everything has to travel a long way to get there. And anything that breaks means either a very long drive or a very expensive call-out fee. That's the math. And the people living there ran it before they moved. And then there's the Murray man. In 1998, a geoglyph of an Aboriginal man holding a spear appeared in the desert near town, about 4 kilometers long and only visible from the air, and nobody has ever officially confirmed who put it there. It just appeared. Marie is exactly the kind of place where that happens, and nobody seems particularly surprised by it. 10 towns, 10 versions of the same deal. Hand over the modern world, or at least the expensive parts of it, and get back something most Australians have stopped believing is actually possible, which is owning your life outright. The trade-offs aren't small. Underground homes, no Wi-Fi, hospitals hours away, and a social life that runs on whoever shows up to the pub on Friday. Those aren't minor inconveniences. Those are the terms, and every town on this list is brutally honest about them. But the people who chose these places did the math and got a different answer. Would you live underground in Coober Pedy, wave at strangers on the highway in Winton, or be the last person before the track swallows you in Marie? Drop a yes or a nope in the comments, because I genuinely want to know who out there is already packing. That's it for today. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more updates you won't want to miss.